Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. My guest today is one of the country's most knowledgeable journalists on the subjects of taxation and business. He is David Cay Johnston of the New York Times. He has written a new book called Free Lunch: How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill. His book deals with the methods by which the already wealthy have used government since approximately 1980 to make themselves richer and richer, while the rest of us fall further and further behind. David Cay Johnston is with me today, of course, to discuss his book. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of MSL. David, thank you for coming up from Rochester.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're one of the few people, well, I think besides myself, you're the only person I've ever seen say in writing that the reason for this is what you and I call, and nobody else calls, legalized bribery.
Yes.
Now, if you would elaborate on that, I'd appreciate
it. We as taxpayers try to get a free lunch from Congress and the state legislatures by not paying the real costs. People go, oh, a congressman make $162,000 a year. Well, if you have to maintain a household in Washington State or Nevada and a household in Washington, that's not so much money. And you have expenses ordinary people don't have going back and forth. So what happens? Even though there are rules on gifts that are supposed to prevent gifts, and I've gone to lunch with federal prosecutors and bureaucrats who insist, no, we have to divide the check up and everybody has to pay separately.
Yeah.
Members of Congress, I tell all about Signature's restaurant that Jack Abramoff ran and all the free meals, and we know exactly how much they made because these politicians who were getting free, very expensive dinners with expensive bottles of wine, they never left tips for the waiters,
right,
who then leaked this stuff to a reporter named Glenn Justice.
You should always treat the guy in the bottom fairly.
Oh, yes.
He can kill you.
And anybody who wants to do investigative reporting, always be nice to the clerks and the secretaries and people without power.
Yeah.
Members of Congress go to give a speech somewhere. A company provides them with a jet. The company not only has the implied favor, we provided you with a company jet and you're going to remember the favor, but they also means that they have hours alone with you to tell you what they want. And if you're a member of Congress, the reality is that your staff schedules your time so that you are spending almost all your time talking to donors, the representative of donors, the associates of people who are donors who are seeking things from you. Here's a little experiment to try. Call up your congressperson and say, hi, I'm so-and-so. I would like 15 minutes with my congressperson at their convenience, at their office. Just tell me when, anytime in the next 3 months, and I'll come. Now, I've been saying this to people in speeches for 10 years. I've had 2 people call me and tell me that they were asked if they were donors. That question is a crime, but that's what they were asked. I've had 5 or 6 people tell me, a small number of them, that they were asked, after they were asked what they wanted to talk about and they decided to mention something specific, they were lectured on what they should think and told that their views were inappropriate. I've had other people tell me that they were promised someone will get back to you. But I've never had anybody call me and tell me they got a meeting. Now, somebody may have and not told me, but try it. See if you can get one. On the other hand, if you're a big donor...
Yeah, we have experience. I mean, we're aware of what you're talking about. We at this law school are aware of what you're talking about.
Well, so what does that tell us? That tells us that members of Congress are spending their time thinking about and concerned with, as economic theory tells us they should, the interests of the donors who keep them in office. And this system of legalized bribery... Campaign contributors.
Yeah.
And this system I call legalized bribery is the free rides in the jet plane, whether it's to give a speech, go on vacation, go on a $250,000 golf outing. We had this $250,000 golf outing. How do you spend $250,000 on a golf outing? You use gold golf balls? They get meals in restaurants. They get... we actually have members of Congress who've had their spouse chair their election committee, and they've paid them a salary that was a percentage of the contributions given. Now, if that doesn't amount to bribery, I don't know then what the point is of having a bribery statute. I think we can stop that. And one way to stop it is to quit focusing on campaign finance reform. The Supreme Court says, in its view in the Buckley case, that dollars are free speech. Now,
can I make a comment? This is one of the most mendacious opinions ever written. Money is free speech. Money is a way of suppressing what everybody else wants to say.
But Larry, but the reality is this Supreme Court is not going to change that opinion.
Oh, that's true.
That decision is
just
so.
venal.
So we have to live with this decision, just like people had to live with the Dred Scott decision. You know, you can agree with the decision or not. We have to live with it. So let's quit trying
No,
to.
we fought America's worst war because of it.
Yes, but we have to live with the decision in the short run. My suggestion is let's try something different. Let's reach into the Constitution and find something the Supreme Court can't object to that may fix this problem. And I call this politician finance reform with zero tolerance. You know, we're big on zero tolerance. Little boy in kindergarten tries to kiss a girl, they expel him from school because we have zero tolerance for harassment. Okay, let's apply this idea. We will pay the full costs of Congress. We will pay for you to have 2 households. We will pay all the expenses associated with your job. And we will get a receipt for every bit of this. We'll have somebody on the staff follow you around. Every dollar, every quarter, we will follow. We will put it all up on the internet. Trust me, there are plenty of organizations in Washington that will figure out how to analyze this data. And while, yes, the congressman from Hawaii will spend a lot more on travel than the one in Northern Virginia, people aren't stupid. They'll figure out how to look for these things. And I would have it go so far that, you know, Senator, if you're on the Health Committee and you really need to inspect the cleanliness of that sink behind the bar in Tahiti, you go right ahead. You go down there. We're going to have a full record of your trip. Everybody you meet with, we're going to have a notice of who you met with and how long, and a synopsis at least of what was discussed. Not the exact details, but we know what the subject was. In return for that, for paying all these costs, so there's no more legalized bribes, no flights and airplanes, no meals, if you take so much as a cup of coffee from a lobbyist, you go to prison.
Well, David, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I only wish it could be. Trust me, I only
A lot of people think it's a naive answer, but a solution. And to them, I say, okay, come up with a better one.
Well,
but let's find a solution. Let's figure out how to get a Congress that serves the interests of the people, not the money people.
Well, David, yes, I admit.
Let's debate it.
I admit that I think it's a naive solution. I only wish it could be true. But let me ask you a question. How about television? Because it is the cost of campaigning that is the major problem these days.
Yes. And, you know, the public owns the airwaves. We certainly could change the campaign finance system by imposing rules on broadcasters about the amount of time they provide. I'm the only reporter in America who caused a broadcast station to lose its license, actually 2 TV and 4 radio stations for news manipulations and blackouts. The law that caused this to happen is no longer on the books. You don't have to be, the same kind of fairness and stuff doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah.
And we don't have the same rules about public service that we used to have. Well, we can change those rules. They were not handed down from some immutable force. The thing about American democracy is that we have a guidepost in the Constitution, and we have the preamble, which people have to sit down and read. It lays out 6 principles, the reasons we created this country: to promote the general welfare, to form a more perfect union, to have domestic tranquility, to promote the common defense. And these 6 ideas that are in the preamble give us the guideposts for what we want to do, to have justice and liberty. And we can change the rules.
But David, look, you know, I'm going to argue with you because I feel it incumbent upon me to point out some things. One is that your idea will immediately go before the Supreme Court, which is likely to say, no, you can't set these rules because you are stopping free speech, just the same way they did in the Buckley case.
No. I actually, in that case, I don't. That's why, Larry. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and you're a dean in a law school. So, but
what do I know?
The franking privilege allows the unlimited mailing of letters by members of Congress. Right? You sign your name, and it gets sent out. And all I'm saying is we're going to extend that expense, that unlimited expense account for mailing, to all the costs of Congress. And the return for that
Does that include TV?
Hold on, no, this is the cost of running Congress. I'm not talking about the campaigns.
Okay.
And in return for paying all the costs of government, you can't take anything. No free rides.
I understand that, but
you
how
want
about
to go
TV?
give a speech, we the taxpayers will pay for going to give that speech. I don't think the Supreme Court can argue that that violates the Constitution.
No, I'm not saying that is what would violate it. I'm saying that if you attempted to set rules for how much television they could be, I'm going to say 2 things, let you address both of them. That's one problem. And the other one is something that I just rail against and revile, but it's the fact. Supreme Court cares not a whit for the preamble to the Constitution. It never has, and it acts as if the preamble doesn't exist.
Well, here's what I hope, Larry. I'm in the diagnosis of problems business, not the solution business.
Yeah.
Much easier business. I'm not a smart enough guy to be in the other business. But what I'm hoping to do here, after laying out the problems in free lunch and showing you through the lives of individual Americans, some of whom got rich, some of whom got ruined, how you are being forced to pay taxes that government never gets to many, many places that go to the pockets of rich people like Warren Buffett, the Walton family, Donald Trump, how we are destroying local businesses and replacing competition with government handcuffing the invisible hand of the market that Adam Smith wrote about, that will stimulate debate about what to do. Now, I offered a solution, the extension of the franking privilege to all the expenses of Congress, politician finance reform instead of campaign finance reform. What I hope to do with that is to stimulate the kind of discussion that you've raised here. And so lawyers who are watching this, sit down, get out a legal pad, think about, okay, how could I create a set of rules that this Supreme Court would have to approve that will reduce the influence of the moneyed class? How can we do this? Because, Larry, I firmly believe there is only one thing you can say or I can say that is un-American. We can't do anything about this. The whole idea of the United States of America is we don't need King George to tell us what to do. What a radical idea that was in the 1700s, that we will govern ourselves. And so long as we stick to that belief, we can solve any problem we have if we want to. We got rid of slavery. It cost 600,000 American lives, and we haven't cleaned up all the mess from it, but we got rid of it, and we've been making progress. Perhaps we're falling a little backwards in that, we judge people less today on the color of their skin than the content of their character. We're judging them too much on the content of their wallet. Women somehow got men to give them the right to vote. The only way they got it was men voted it for them. And we can solve this problem. We can have a government responsive to the people as a whole, which will make us a healthier, wealthier, more stable society. But we can't do it unless we start discussing, how are we going to accomplish this, and put the time into it. And the fact that lots of people have to work 2 jobs, and we have lots of women working not because they want to, but because they have to instead of raising their kids. The fact that we have removed all sorts of institutions from our society or reduced their size, like, for example, unions, that have been an important force for promoting some balance in the debate.
That's a very important point.
Yes, all of these things play a role, and nobody ever said it was going to be easy.
Yeah. We have had Dr. Relman on here talking about the profit motive destroying medicine, to the tune that it costs an extra $250 billion because of the office expense and the back office
Paperwork.
expense. But yeah, right. It seems to me that what happened in medicine is the equivalent of what happened in Russia when the communist government was overthrown, and they sold all these companies to these guys who are now the world's, among the world's preeminent billionaires. They sold it to them for a swung. That happened in medicine.
Yes, it did. And let me preface this by saying that in addition to being a reporter and being a union member and at one time the head of a union, I'm also the chairman of the board of a little company that one of my sons and I run. I don't have any aversion to corporations or to wealth. I do have an aversion to corporations getting government to pass a law that reaches into my pocket and takes money out of it when I haven't even done business with the company or for something other than my doing business with them. If medicine as a business worked, I'd be the first guy to say, boy, that's fabulous. The problem is it doesn't work. Maximizing return to capital is the proper standard for taking care of capital, but it is not the proper standard for taking care of people's health.
Which is what doctors will agree
with. It's exactly what we're doing. And doctors in this country are spending enormous amounts of time and effort on paperwork and tracking billing and having bills rejected. I've actually had a couple of people tell me that it's actually a good thing that we have this whole huge paperwork exercise by insurance companies to deny care because it creates jobs. Well, that's an unbelievably stupid remark, but you know what? If you want to create jobs inefficiently, I got a perfect method for that. I think we should ban all earth grading equipment, and all construction sites should employ people using teaspoons to move the dirt around.
The Chinese communist method.
That's right. That'll create jobs. Not even shovels. Let's go down to teaspoons and really create jobs. Even the disabled can work in some of those jobs, right?
Yeah.
We had a system in this country in the 1800s of fire insurance. You bought fire insurance from one company, I bought it from another. And what that really meant is if there was a fire company came and put the fire out. So one day a fire breaks out. Your house is on fire. My fire insurance company is down the street, so they get here first. But they won't fight the fire in your building. You didn't pay them. By the time your company gets here, my house has caught fire, and now both fires burn. It didn't take people very long to figure out that this was a stupid system. And guess what we got? Well, I got fire departments. I guess you could call it socialized fire departments, just like we have socialized police departments, socialized prosecutors, socialized kindergarten, socialized highways, socialized parks.
Now that's a very pertinent point. You can make, because we see that a lot of things are getting outsourced to private industry today. With the disasters in Iraq, and they're running jails, and they're taking over toll roads and bridges, and so that's going to become private industry. It used to be governmental. Things that are now private industry can become governmental, but people attack it with the word socialism.
Yes, and yet, we're social animals, and what we found as a practical matter is this is the most efficient way to do things, to have a fire department whose job is to fight fires. And by the way, that's also a field subject to research and engineering, so a lot fewer people die now than used to, and if we had tougher building codes, deaths would fall away dramatically in this country. All right. Now, in healthcare, we set up a system during the beginning of the Nixon administration of giving taxpayer money to people to start healthcare enterprises. They were nonprofits, and in some states like California, they were actually charities, because not all nonprofits are charities. The government gave the capital to start these. They were called prepaid health plans, or the marketing term the Nixon people came up with was health maintenance organizations, HMOs. Now they're all over the country. Ronald Reagan came in and said, I don't like this, I want to stop this, I want a free enterprise solution. By the way, Nixon thought that was a free enterprise solution. Well, the people who ran these things then began converting and buying them. Now, you can buy the assets of any nonprofit. You could buy the nonprofit Massachusetts School of Law. The only requirement historically has been you have to pay the top dollar for the assets. The Ford Foundation relies on that when it sells stock. Whatever the market price is of the stock in its portfolio, it gets it. Well, the owners of these enterprises didn't want to pay that much. They wanted to pay pennies on the dollar. In one case, they wanted to pay a tiny fraction of a penny on the dollar. There's a couple I tell about, Wasserman and Anderson, who for $1,900 a month of interest, tax-deductible interest, they controlled $1 billion organization set up with taxpayer money.
What did government do that facilitated or enabled that?
Well, here's what happened is the government allowed then the sale or conversion of Blue Cross Blue Shield from nonprofit to for-profit and the sale of HMOs. The problem wasn't the conversion in the beginning. First, it was that the pricing was unfair. There was basically the theft of these assets. And I actually quote a couple of executives in the field about everybody knows that these deals were not
Can I ask you a question? What you're saying then is government failed to enforce the law and thereby permitted this to happen.
Not only that, but the key case was a California case where the state corporation commissioner overturned 400 years of unbroken legal decisions and said you don't have to get the highest price, you only have to get a reasonable price. And so an entity that Dr. Robert Gumbiner, the fellow involved, had himself valued over $200 million, was sold to him for about a sixth of that price. And he had tried to buy.
That wasn't a reasonable price. Government's allowing a non-reasonable price.
That's right.
At first it says it's got to be reasonable.
Government allowed this.
Yeah.
And when the Attorney General went to attack this in court, it turned out that Gumbiner, who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar some years earlier engaging in self-dealing, that is, putting his interests, his business interests ahead of the charity, and then had signed an agreement with the Attorney General promising, well, without admitting I did that, I won't do it again, and then was allowed to continue to be there with the cookie jar. He'd gone to Sacramento and gotten the legislature to pass a law signed by Jerry Brown that authorized him to engage in self-dealing. So we actually had somebody authorize what is a civil and could be a criminal offense. So when the Attorney General tried to fight this lowball pricing, they were told sorry by the California courts. The legislature said they can do this. The court decision didn't say anything about this is wrong or immoral, it just observed it as a fact. So all across America, we had conversions of health care plans from nonprofit to for-profit. Now, the first thing that happens when they convert is the for-profit company announces its earnings the first 90-day period, and they always announce, we have reduced our medical loss ratio. And what that means is we're spending less of the money people gave us for their health care on their health care. Typically, they reduce it by a dime. Well, if you're taking in $3-4 billion a year, a dime on every dollar is a lot of money and a lot of denied health care.
3 to 400 million.
I asked one of the people who did not do this, Howard Berman, who built up the Blue Cross Blue Shield in all of Western New York.
This is an astounding story about Berman.
Yes, and Howard Berman took the Blue Cross in Rochester, built it into all throughout Western and upstate New York enterprise of about $4 billion, and is thought of by everybody there as a pay pig, because every year the local newspapers report his salary. It's publicly disclosed, and it's like $1.5 million a year. And to most people that sounds outrageous. Of course, if it were a private business, he'd be making $10 or $15 million perhaps.
He'd be ashamed of his salary.
But had he converted the enterprise, he would have made a fortune. And so I went to Howard one day, whom I know, and I said, you know, Howard, why didn't you do this? I mean, you could have owned your own jet airplane. You could have more money than you could possibly know what to do with. It would have been easy to do. And he looked at me and he said, because it would be wrong. Because it would mean increasing my wealth at the expense of the subscriber's health. Now, there aren't a lot of people, given the opportunity to make a fortune, who walk away from it because it would be morally repugnant. And so one of the things I try to do, Larry, in the book is not just tell you about the scalawags, but tell you about a lot of little heroes in there.
Yeah. David, because it would be wrong. We now live in a society, do we not, where most people have take the position that if it's legal, it's okay. If it's legal, not only is it okay, that means either that it is moral, which is baloney, or that morality is irrelevant.
Yeah, I don't think that's unique to our time. You know, in the South, there was a time when there were lynchings. We changed the rules and said, you can't do this anymore, and it stopped. Government, by setting the rules, determines the limits of behavior. And yes, I had several businessmen, including a prominent libertarian, tell me that yes, they took subsidies, but after all, if the government allows it, you'd be fool not to do it. One of them actually said to me that if they didn't do this, they thought shareholders might sue for wasting corporate assets. And I thought, yeah, I'd like to see that lawsuit. Boy, I don't like litigation. I think litigation's a terrible way to solve problems. But you know what? There's a lawsuit I'd like to see the defense of, because I suspect the plaintiff will get thrown out on his ear that you turn down a subsidy. But the rules matter. Rules define our civilization. And if the rules say the rich can take from the poor, there are a lot of rich people who will justify that by saying, but it says in the law I can do so. And you will have religious people. You know, one of the stories I tell in the book is about the Hilton family. Now, most people think the Hiltons are rich because of Hilton hotels. Not true. Conrad Hilton, the founder, left his fortune to the poor children of the earth. Even before he was dead, his son Barron was plotting to take that money away. And Conrad Hilton said before he died to his lawyer, you know, Barron's got too damn much money. And he kept reducing the amount of money going to Barron. Well, within 10 days of Conrad Hilton's death, Barron Hilton put in place his plan to take the fortune away from poor children for himself. He was fought by the other executor of the estate, his father's lawyer. He was fought by the California Attorney General. He was fought by some nuns until they were shut down by Archbishop, now Cardinal Mahoney in Los Angeles, who you often can see in the presence of Barron Hilton. I wrote about it in the Los Angeles Times at the time. The IRS turned down Barron Hilton, and they all said, this is nonsense. He finally got a court decision, the very same court, by the way, that ruled that in the Gumbiner case that he could buy the charity for a fraction of its real value. He got a decision that ignored what the will said, misstated the facts horribly, and muddied the waters. And Barron Hilton took that and went to the other parties and said, you should settle with me. And they decided that that was the smart thing to do in view of this decision. So for his lifetime, he got 60% of the income to go to poor children. Now think about this. This is Barron Hilton, who is portrayed frequently in the news media as this very pious Catholic. You may recall that Paris Hilton actually saw to it that she was photographed carrying her Bible. Although when Larry King asked her on national television to say something that was in the Bible, she couldn't cite you a single fact. And the rules matter.
How about Jesus wept?
And yes, and you could get some real simple short ones.
Yeah.
But the rules matter. And I cite the Hiltons because this is, I think, the extreme example of the rules and behavior. I mean, this is a case of literally snatching money out of the mouths of starving children so that you can have $50 million a year of income. Yeah. And yeah, I'll make a moral statement about it. I think that's not appropriate conduct, but I'm sure there are listeners out there who will disagree.
The
And
two
warn
things
you
that
that we
seem
have-
to be related. One is the stadiums, and the other is giving Walmart and other companies like that huge freebies to come in, and thereby destroying all the other local businesses. And what you called on television the other day, I thought this was a wonderful, the burger class, meaning Burgher.
Right.
The burgers as they used to know burgers a couple hundred years ago.
Well, the quality of life in whatever community you live in depends a lot on the local people who own local businesses at all different kinds, manufacturing, banks, et cetera. And those communities where all the capital is controlled in a distant place tend to be impoverished both financially and culturally and socially. West Virginia, almost all capital elsewhere. That's what we think of exploited third world countries or colonies.
You know, to this day, the South claims that one of its problems after the Civil War was that Northern capital took over large parts of the South.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so I think that in my experience in life tells me that these merchants and manufacturers and bankers who have their life staked in that community tend to look out for it because they have an interest in that because this is their life and this is where they're invested. Well, we have this bizarre policy going on where we are taxing these local merchants to subsidize the big national chains, Walmart, Target, Lowe's, the whole group of them, and in some cases, whole shopping centers.
Now, how are they subsidizing?
Well, just before I get to that, one of the most amazing parts of this story is that these local business owners have not risen up and stopped this. And the reason is their national associations in their literature don't tell them what's going on here, okay? Now, here's how they do it. It's called TIF. You'll read it in the newspapers, TIF. You'll hear it on TV, the magic of tax increment financing. We're going to get a new Walmart store in our community through the magic of tax increment financing. You have any idea what that means?
I do, but when
you do, but I don't think most people do.
No, I didn't before I heard you
talk
talk
about it. What it means is the owners of the store get to keep the sales taxes that you are forced to pay at the cash register, because all taxes are ultimately collected through the coercive power of the state. And instead of that money going to the schools and the fire department and the police department and the libraries, it is funneled through a mechanism of local government, usually a special authority, to finance the purchase of municipal bonds. So that means that the Wall Street underwriters and the lawyers and the auditors and other people all get a piece of this money to buy the land and build the store. And often the company that's coming in picks its own developer and builds the store. Then the store is leased to these people on terms that amount to giving it to them for free or nearly free over a period of time. So not only are the local government services not getting this sales tax money, and the advocates would say, well, but it's increment financing. These are extra taxes. Well, it's only extra taxes if there's a huge increase in incomes in the community or population growth. And if either of those occurs, the market should provide that. Investors will come in and say, oh, that place is growing. Let's build a supermarket. Let's build a department store. You don't need government doing this. But here's the other effect, the really, I think, most perverse effect. It's destroying the locally owned businesses. And one of the stories I tell is about a man named Jim Weeknecht in the Poconos of Pennsylvania. He had a little business selling hunting gear and fishing tackle and outdoor gear to people. He made enough money that his wife Julie could stay at home and raise their 3 kids. And one day, Cabela's, a big national chain cited by President Bush and Vice President Cheney as a model of capitalism and entrepreneurialism, comes to this town and persuades the local burghers to give them $32 million of subsidies through this system. Keep the sales taxes and don't pay property taxes for a number of years.
Can I interject? The relief from property taxes is a huge, big deal.
Yes.
And it's one of the reasons why when the Walmarts come in, they can undercut the lower guy.
That's exactly right. And so this guy, Jim Weeknecht, the way he made his living was he always kept a Cabela's catalog at the cash register. And when somebody would question the price for a hunting bow or a jacket to be warm when you're sitting in the deer blind, he would say, well, look, here's the very same thing in the Cabela's catalog, and my price is lower. He was the more efficient operator for the consumer. Well, they built this store, and the claim to the local fathers was, this store will be a destination store. This little town is on a highway that runs from Harrisburg to Manhattan. And they said, oh, people are going to come from Connecticut and down in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. They're all going to come to this store. And Jim Weeknecht thought, this is crazy. First of all, you can buy all this stuff out of a catalog. who's going to drive a day or two to go to a sporting goods store? Well, even though they charged higher prices, Cabela's ran them out of business. And his view is, look, if big merchants can run me out of business because they're more efficient, then I'll accept that that's the system. But local government shouldn't be making these decisions. Now, there is one company in America, Larry, that fights these subsidies. It's called Gander Mountain. Gander Mountain is in the same business. They sell hunting and fishing gear. They're based in Minnesota. They actually have given back to 2 different cities subsidies that they got. They have sent a lobbying firm that they've employed all over America trying to stop these subsidies. In one case, they own a store in Greenwood, Indiana. They built. You walk out the door of that store and look across the highway, and there's a big lot where either Cabela's or Bass Pro, the other big company in this field, says they're going to build a new store. And the city fathers are giving these guys $18 million. Well, a system in which local government, or government at any level, picks the winners in the economy is not capitalism, it's not competition, it's not free markets, it's not the things Ronald Reagan said, it's corporate socialism. It is statism. It is the state making these choices. And
sometimes it used to be called fascism.
If the corporations control the government as well. And if people understood these things, I'm not sure that they would be going forward. And I firmly believe the reason that you don't see the merchant class, the local burger class, objecting is they don't really understand these things. The big national chains argument is, well, if you don't give us this subsidy, we'll go to the next town and we'll build over there and they'll get all the benefit. Subsidies to retail cannot make us wealthier. Retail is the end of the economic line. If you're going to subsidize things, first subsidize education, then subsidize basic research, then subsidize applied research and development, maybe in some cases subsidize infrastructure that makes things work, rail and canals and highways, and maybe in some cases manufacturing or mining to get something going. But the least bang for the buck, and often the negative bang for the buck, will be in subsidizing retail. But this is at the core of this problem. What's happening is the Walton family, the richest family in America, is getting welfare. They apparently have no shame about this, just as Baron Hilton and Paris Hilton have no shame about taking from the poor. They are actively soliciting this money. And I go through in detail the arguments that they make to justify this in Free Lunch. Too detailed to go through here, but in the book I show argument by argument how every single assertion that they make just falls over like a house of cards with just, that's how weak the arguments are.
David, I once read a book about Waltons and their fortune, and it turns out, I've never heard anybody mention this. I'm just going to mention, then I'd like to ask you about Snow and the CSX. But they were not, as you know, providing medical insurance. And it was thought that by doing so, they saved something like 7% on every, or 8% on every dollar they took in. Their return on revenue was 1%. What that meant, which is standard for that kind of business.
They weren't a viable business if they covered the real costs.
They had no, or at least it would have been a lot more expensive.
Well, one of the things in Free Lunch I do is show a whole group of industries that are what I call economic polluters. Pollution we think of in the environmental sense. A company, instead of cleaning up its waste, throws them out the smokestack or drops them into the river through a drain pipe. Well, you can have economic pollution too. You take the real costs of your business and you throw them on the taxpayers. Big retailers like Walmart that provide minimal or no health insurance, although in response to public opposition, they've been making improvements there.
Right.
And instead, people have to go on government-financed health care, are economic polluters. They're reporting profits, but they're not earning them in the market. They're earning them by polluting the economy. And build a better mousetrap, have a better service, make a lot of money in your business, but make it by covering your real costs and turning a profit.
A colleague of yours, whom I think you mentioned in your acknowledgement section, named Walt Bogdanich.
Yes, great reporter.
Yes, he wrote a 5-part series on the lack of safety at rail crossings. And I gather he got a lot, and occasionally quoted, but he got a lot of his material from a friend of mine whom I will not identify it and say it's Harvey. I'm not going to mention any last names. But if Harvey sees this, he'll know and so on. He'll be happy. And you tell the story of John Snow, a name I first ran across in a major litigation with which he had no real responsibility. I mean, I find this just morally, what he did is morally repugnant. Morally, at least, I think he belongs in the slammer. Legally, I don't know.
Well, I don't think legally there's any issue here, but John Snow was the son of a litigator in Toledo, Ohio, who was virtually blind. So he must have been an awfully great attorney. If you're virtually blind, you're a successful litigator. He grew up, he's a brilliant man. By age 25, I believe he had 2 doctorates and a law degree, and he was a professor, and he was teaching economics. I've read his doctoral thesis, which I will tell you, however, is amazingly thin, and it was about how government training auto mechanics interferes with the market and isn't a good thing. He came to the attention of the Ford administration and became an assistant or deputy secretary in the transportation department, where he worked to have, quote unquote, deregulation of the trucking industry. And as I said before, there is no deregulation, there's only new regulation.
Are there new rules?
But to bring, his idea was we need to have more competition.
Yeah.
He also came to the attention of a man named Hayes Watkins, who ran what is now the CSX Railroad.
Oh, I know him very well.
And Hayes Watkins won the Industry Week magazine award as Executive of the Year for government relations.
Can I tell you a little funny thing? I'm going to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you a little funny thing. I was in this case which ended up ultimately involving $700 million in the days when there was real money. And my opponent, after I euchred out of my opponent a document written by Hayes Watkins, which they had hid, they wouldn't turn over, we finally got it out of him. My opponent called me one day and he said, "Is that not the finest antitrust document you ever read?" It was! But anyway, go ahead.
Well, Hayes Watkins wins this award, and he and his protege, John Snow, who has become his lobbyist, tell how they run the railroad. He says, like previous winners of this award, like Reginald Jones ran GE, I don't hang out with presidents of the United States. But every other week, John Snow and I get in the Oldsmobile and we drive up from Richmond, Virginia, and we go to see Cabinet Secretary for Transportation and senators and the staffs on the transportation committees and the bureaucrats at the Federal Railroad Administration, and we talk to them about our concerns. That is, he worked the government, not the market, the government. Well, when John Snow in 1985 by 1985, he was in charge of the railroad, and he later succeeded Watkins. And he did a lot of things for his own self-benefit. He worked there, I think, 23 years and got 44 years of pension benefits, for example. Well, the stock went down, his salary went up by 70%. But one of the things that he did was he ordered enormous cost cutting. And they encouraged stories about how they had made more efficient use of locomotives and things that you would think are praiseworthy. But he also had them cut safety. Well, one day in 1991, there's an Amtrak train heading up from Florida to New York. The crew is sober, they're going lower than the posted speed limit, conditions are clear, the rolling stock is in perfect shape. The first 6 or 12 cars go over something called the Orlon crossing, and suddenly the switch breaks. A bunch of cars fly through the air, they hit some hopper cars parked right next to them, flip them over, and the steel wheels just cut through the aluminum skins of the passenger cars. 77 people are injured and 7 people are killed, including a Miami police sergeant. Everybody settles very quickly. And by the way, you die in a transportation accident, you don't get very much money. The widow of the police officer says to herself, I don't believe this was an accident, an unavoidable, unpredictable thing. I don't believe that. And she fights for years. She gets all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately with her case. And what did she find out? Well, first of all, the official investigation shows that this switch had been repaired 10 years earlier, where a cotter pin, a bolt basically, that's supposed to hold 2 pieces together, they put a nail in it. By now a rusty nail, which presumably rusted through after 10 years. They made all sorts of efforts to, with shims and grease, adjust this thing when you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to replace it. The lawsuit turns up witnesses who worked there and who come in and testify that, well, there wasn't enough time to do all the work, and we often worked off the books and worked 10 or 12 hours for 8 hours pay, but we couldn't get the work done. They kept cutting the crews and expanding the amount of work to do. The railroad tries to stop this from coming in. Judge lets it in. At the first trial, the jury awards $6.5 million for actual damages. Then they have a punitive damage trial. The jury awards $50 million, which is 1% of the net worth of the company. And they write a note saying they hope something like this never happens again. The company objects. The judge trying the case says the conduct of CSX is borderline criminal. the Court of Appeals upholds what that judge says and states it even more strongly. They ultimately get to the U.S. Supreme Court, which won't listen to the case. CSX now is faced with this $50 million bill. So what did they do? Well, it turns out there was a law passed by Congress that exempts CSX from paying the damages. CSX simply went to the government and said, here's the bill, you get to pay. Now, a law that says we lease the right to go over our rails to Amtrak, and if you have a drunken engineer or bad equipment, you have to pay, makes perfect sense. But this law doesn't do that. This law rewarded John Snow and the company by saying you engage in reckless, wanton behavior, depraved indifference to human life, as Law and Order shows like to tell us, and people die and you profit. Risk and reward should be connected. But we have lots of laws we've passed that absolve people of risk and let them have the reward. We pollute the economy in this way. We endanger people's lives in this way. And so what happened to John Snow after this atrocious behavior? Why, he was appointed Treasury Secretary of the United States.
David, we had a great woman from Harvard Law School, a professor was on here, oh gosh, a couple of years ago, probably before, Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, Elizabeth Warren, brilliant researcher.
Yeah, wonderful person, and a brilliant woman and a wonderful person. And she told the story she was addressing, I don't know whether it was Citibank, a whole bunch of people. And because they wanted to know why they were having the degree of losses they were having on their loans. You know about this?
No.
And she noticed that the audience wasn't reacting too well because she was saying, well, the reason you've got such a high rate of default on your loans is because you're loaning to people who are not creditworthy. Right. And if you would stop that, and finally the chairman of the board or somebody raised his hand and said, Professor Warren, that's where we make our money.
Right.
Now,
well, let me explain. Michael Milken was this genius, economic genius, who figured out that a very large and diversified portfolio of junk bonds, high-risk bonds, some of which would never pay off, would produce bigger returns for you than investing in the stock market. Because you could buy them, bonds that were sold for $1,000, you could buy for $400. And some of them you'd lose the $400. Some would eventually pay off the full amount. In the meantime, the interest you were collecting, if it was 10% interest, you were effectively collecting 25. Well, what the big banks have done is simply applied that to the credit card business. We'll loan money at $5,000 a pop to 20 million people. A lot of them will fall behind in their payments. And then we're going to hit them with late fees. We're going to jack their interest rate up to 29%. We're going to collect a lot of interest from them, and eventually when we write off the principal, we've already collected it 3 times over to begin with.
The government doesn't stop that kind of usury.
Well, in fact, we had usury laws until 1978. Recently, it's about 500 years ago, we put people to death for loaning money at interest. And in Muslim countries, it's still a crime. They have devices to get around it. In 1978, in the Marquette case, the U.S. Supreme Court looked at a conflict between state and federal banking laws and basically vitiated the usury laws and said in its decision to Congress, this is a problem, you need to address it. Well, Congress did, and what they did was they began mining the banks for campaign contributions. They didn't fix the problem. So now there's TV ads with Gary Coleman, the child actor who famously his parents ripped off all his money, saying, call this number and we'll put money right in your bank. I did, I called, and within an hour I had my money. Well, if you go to the website and look at the fine print that just flashes on the screen, you pay 99.25% interest. I mean, these guys are so greedy, they got to get the extra quarter of a point. And for borrowing $2,600, they say that's their average loan, you'll pay back around $10,000, assuming you make your loan payments on time. Now, I used to know a mob guy years ago who was a loan shark, among other things. And he went to prison for charging 2 points a week, which in simple interest is 104%. And I wish he were alive because I would love to have him come with me to some TV show.
It's a perfect illustration to me, David, of my view the Supreme Court. It's worse than worthless. It's dangerous. I happen to know at one point in my life, and have worked very closely with the guy who won that case. It was against Minnesota, I believe.
Yes. Minnesota and Nebraska.
He shouldn't have been, he was, but he shouldn't have been proud of it. And he's a very well-known guy and a very brilliant lawyer. But, the Supreme Court, I don't think they care about the little man.
Well, but there's an important point I want to make sure that the viewers don't miss there, and that is, look, there are Supreme Court decisions I like and ones other people don't like. We can't have a functioning society unless we accept that We have 3 co-equal branches of government, and they make the rules. And when we don't like them, get rid of them. We have all these people I read about who are tax deniers. They claim Congress really can't tax your wages, and they send me emails all the time. And I say to them, that's nonsense. The law is very clear. You can be taxed. You can go to prison. And if you don't like the system, elect a new Congress.
I understand.
You don't like the president, elect a new president.
Yeah, but
you don't like the Supreme Court, it
there's
takes a
nothing
little
you
bit
can
longer.
do. Yeah, right. There's nothing you can do about a guy who does evil and's got life tenure. That's just the way it is.
Yep. Change the Constitution.
Well,
That we can
possibly.
do if we wanted to.
There are people who think that, who want to
limit the tenure or the age of justices.
Absolutely. The reason I brought up the banks, David, is that the banks and the mortgage brokers and the investment banks, a lot of people don't realize there's investment banks and then there's commercial
banks, right.
All of them have been deeply involved, and partly they were all able to get involved because of the demise of Glass-Steagall, which is a whole other business,
Right.
which caused a lot of this disaster, the demise of Glass-Steagall. They knew that this subprime stuff was no good.
Well, Larry, there's a fundamental principle of money. Most people, frankly, just do not understand money. There's lots of research on this. To most people, money is a stream of cash. You get an allowance as a child, you get a paycheck when you work, you get a pension check when you're old. They do not understand assets and capital. And in fact, you know what? If it was easy to manage assets and capital, people on Wall Street wouldn't get the salaries that they're getting. It's a very complicated, sophisticated business. And in the areas of banking and insurance, and you know what, a bank and insurance company are the exact same thing with different rules. You make a deposit. At the bank, you write a check, you get your money back. At the insurance company, there's an event. You get maybe much more than you paid back, and there's no event, you get nothing. But it's the same principle. You make a deposit, there's a return. These are such complicated issues that government put rules in place to protect people from predators. And just as we in this country created things under the Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, et cetera, to protect the inconvenient individual from the predator king or the state as a predator, we had rules to protect people from financial predators. Then we got this nutty notion, this put forth by supposed conservatives who were in fact radicals. We don't need any of that. The market will provide. Well, we've now had years of seeing what the market provides. Americans overall are in debt up to their eyeballs. The Europeans kept their system. Guess what? Most Europeans aren't in debt. And if they are, it's very minimal debt. They don't have subprime mortgage scandals like we do. We don't have neighborhoods in Europe where 1/3 of the houses are or will soon be empty. And even in the finest neighborhood, if 1/3 of the houses go empty, you will begin to have social problems.
And that is happening.
That is absolutely happening in some neighborhoods in the United States. We didn't have this corrupt system of charity down payments where you can't sell your house for $200,000, so you sell it for $240,000. You give $40,000 to a charity, which then gives it to the people buying the house to you, so they can say they made a 20% down payment, and the house didn't sell at $200,000 because it's really only worth $150,000. And who gets stuck with the bill? Well, the bank. But where did the bank get its money? You and I deposited our paychecks there, our savings there. So regulation, the very best regulation, is self-reinforcing and doesn't require the government. For example, we used to have rules for partnerships for lawyers and accountants. Every partner was individually liable for the acts of every other partner. So if you and I were law partners and one day, Larry, you think, what in the heck is David doing with this client? He's going to get me in trouble and I'm going to lose my house. You'd be in my office saying, what's going on? Under the new limited liability partnership rules, so long as you keep your nose out of my office, whatever misconduct I do, your only risk is you might lose your investment in the law firm. And you're going to have enough notice of what's coming to squeeze money out of it anyway before everything falls apart.
Well, if you do well, I benefit.
And if my corrupt deal works, and often they do, you benefit. So we've taken a virtuous regulatory system and turned it into a vicious one. Well, we want to have the same thing with banks and other places. We want to have rules that we know work, that protect the naive, the foolish, and the innocent, and even the moderately sophisticated from predators. And not all regulation is good, and not all of it is bad. What you want is wise regulation that promotes stability, that rewards good conduct, and that punishes bad conduct, and that doesn't allow people to play games with the system and profit off it. It requires you to disgorge your ill-got gains, not to pay a traffic fine.
David, I'm going to make a comment to save time, and then I'm going to ask you one last question. The comment I want to make is, you point out in your book that people like Billy Tawson, that's what they call him, Billy, who was the head of the House committee that was dealing with the American pharmaceutical industry and did their bidding, I think it's a fair way to, and he then moves into a job as head of their trade association, not at $100,000, not at $1 million, not at $2 million, $2.5 million a year.
Plus a $100 million budget.
That's nice work if you can get it.
Right.
And that's what these guys in Congress are doing. The last substantive question, then I want to ask you one other question that's not substantive. Would you explain the scam of the government guarantees for student loans?
Yes. When a bank loans money, it takes a risk the loan won't be paid back. And not all loans get paid back. Banks write off loans. Nonetheless, banking is a very profitable business. The big banks earn about a 17% return on their equity. Equity is, if you put a $100 deposit into the bank account and get 5% interest, you got a 5% return on your equity. Banks overall earn 17%. But the student loan companies...
By the way, 17%.
It's a very good return.
Whoa.
Oh, it's a terrific return.
Yeah.
That's why everybody wants to be in the banking industry. Who wants to build cars or widgets when you can be in banking? General Electric is primarily in the banking business. Now, the student loan companies have two deals from the government that violate market principles of risk and reward. The banks make 17% because they've learned how to price risk and judge very well who will and won't pay back and what they can charge them. First of all, of the $85 billion a year of loans, it's an enormous market, $85 billion a year of new loans. Some of them are what are called subsidized loans. And what that means is the government guarantees repayment. No matter what happens, the government gets repaid. On the others,
the borrower may welch, but the lender gets repaid.
Taxpayers will have to repay.
Yeah.
The other loans, Congress has passed a law that it doesn't matter if you file bankruptcy, you can't get out of that loan. Now, not everybody who goes to college succeeds. Some people just aren't successful. Some people go into a field that's in decline by the time they get their degree. Some people are walking down the street and the guy robbing a bank shoots them in the back by accident, or the cop shooting out with a bandit, stray bullet hits them. They get hit by a bus. They get sick. Something bad happens to them in their lives. Well, the lending companies immediately charge them late fees and jack up their interest rate. Your 6.8% loan becomes your 29% loan, which makes it almost impossible to pay off.
Is there any limit on their interest rate?
No. And the only way that you can get out of that loan is to pay it back, to become totally and permanently disabled. And there are people out there who have had Social Security declare them totally and permanently disabled because they're paralyzed and they've had to fight to get their loan discharged. Or you die broke. The profits as a result of the lenders are off the charts. Sallie Mae, the big lender, had an average return on equity in the last 5 years of 51%. That's the equivalent of a bank telling you we'll pay you 51% interest on your savings account. That's what they got. And I quote some young people who are heavily burdened with these loans. And one of them says of Albert Lord, the head of Sallie Mae, who's become a billionaire. So this is what the system means. I'm in my 40s, I have children, we can't afford a house, so my children have no yard to play in. But Albert Lord has a private personal golf course in Washington, D.C., where $1 million houses are a dime a dozen. This is not capitalism. This is corporate socialism. And more importantly, here's the underlying question. What are we doing charging students to go to college? If the idea is that you should invest in your own future, then why don't we eliminate public education? By the way, there are people calling themselves conservatives who want to eliminate public education. And let's carry this idea to its logical conclusion. If you should personally pay for anything that will advance your interests, I think we should start a government program to loan money to babies to pay their mothers to love them. The more you pay your mother, presumably the better care she'll take care of you, and the more successful you'll be. This is absurd.
This illustrates the principle, as it were, that when there is no limit placed upon a principle, the principle here being that everything should be done privately, disaster is
That's right. And as I said before, society's defined by its rules. We used to allow, as a society, lynchings in the South. Now we have rules that say you can't do that. We have rules about all sorts of things in our society, and those rules shape our society. And what has happened to us in the last 28 years is that we have adopted a whole host of rules that benefit the already rich and the sophisticated and the sharks against the poor, the middle class, the innocent, the naive, and the foolish. That breeds social instability. It is not the way to grease the wheels of commerce, to promote a more perfect union, domestic tranquility, and establish justice, which are the reasons we created this country.
I take apparently you delivered 9 speeches over the weekend.
Yeah.
I guess there must be, and this is we're taping this on a Monday. There must be a phenomenal. This is the last question I'm going to ask, because I know you've got to get to the airport. There must be a phenomenal amount of interest in your book and in what you have to say, and of course you must also have phenomenal lung power to be able to do this all the time. But am I right that there is this tremendous degree of interest?
Well, we've sold in 2 months about half as many copies of Free Lunch as I sold of Perfectly Legal after 4 years. I think that's because I once had another reporter say about me that I had an incurable case of premature articulation, because she said, if you want to know what'll be in the news 6 months from now, read David's byline.
Yeah.
In this case, I think I hit the curve at the right place. It's been 28 years since Reagan asked, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And I think a lot of people are beginning to look around and say, you know, what happened here? I was supposed to be better off. And the country's better off. The economy's done well. Why aren't I better off? Why do I have less of a health plan? Why is my pension plan gone? Why are I only getting wage increases? And I had a banker tell me something I thought was very interesting. I mentioned that the chairman of the board of the bank had just been reported that day made $26 million. And this low-level bank executive said to me, well, you know why they pay that kind of money? And I said, well, for performance? No. They pay him that kind of money because they've persuaded almost all of us at the bank to just take a very small increase, roughly the cost of living, and to the degree to which the executive is successful in holding down your wages, he gets a portion of it as a bonus that increases his pay. Not a bad theory, it seems to me. But fundamentally, I think a lot of Americans are saying, what happened? And what I do in Free Lunch is explain to you, here's how it was done to you. Here's how, even if you never do business with Tyco, they are reaching into your pocket and making you give them money. And I think most people don't want to spend 1 minute of their life working to give money to some rich company. They may want to give it to their church or their school or their children, but not to Donald Trump, not to Warren Buffett. And what I do is explain to you, here's how they did it. And my belief is this: if enough people understand how this was done, and the book is all told through the stories of individual Americans. It's not dry policy. It's very easy to read. Things will change. Because one thing's true about politicians. It was true in ancient Rome and the Republic. It's true today. They all get up in the morning and they see which way the wind is blowing. And when the letters to the editors of the newspaper and the questions asked at those rare occasions when Congress people become available to the public and senators, and when people appear on talk shows and call into radio shows begin to shift, the culture will begin to shift. And people will begin to ask new questions about what's happening. And I don't think that there is a very large constituency for taking from the middle class and the poor to give to the rich. But maybe we'll find out.
Very small constituency, but enormously wealthy. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck with the book, and what can I say? Tragic situation we find ourselves in. Be with us again next time, ladies and gentlemen, for the next installment of Books of Our Time.